All right, let's begin our exploration of absolutism in Russia by taking a look at the rule of Peter the Great. Now, to start, we're going to see that Russia has differences from Europe at this time period. So the first one we see here says that serfdom continued in Russia until the mid-1800s. That's true. Even though there was serfdom in Europe in the Middle Ages, by the time you get through the end of the Middle Ages, serfdom in Europe sort of came to an end, especially by the end of the French Revolution. But in Russia, serfdom is going to last all the way through the 1800s, so much longer than the rest of Europe. We also know that Mongol rule had cut Russia off from the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. So the Mongol invasions had actually taken over parts of Russia. And in this case, Russia was sort of isolated from all the other events that were going on in Europe through the late Middle Ages into the Renaissance. So they missed out on the rebirth of the Renaissance discovery of classical learning from the past, but they also didn't have the opportunity to build large navies and go off on explorations across the Atlantic to find new colonies. So they missed out on both of those events. Now, in the Middle Ages, Russia had actually looked towards Constantinople, not Rome, for its leadership. As a result of the Byzantine style of rule, like we saw with Justinian as an emperor over the empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the rule over the church, seemed to be what was taking place in Russia as well. In addition to that, Russians had adopted Eastern Orthodox branch of Christianity. So Russians were Christian, but they were practicing Orthodox Christianity, much like Greek Orthodox Christianity, or the type of Christianity being practiced in the Byzantine Empire, not Roman Catholicism. So as a result, they also didn't participate in much of the events that surrounded the Reformation that were going on in Western Europe. Okay, so we also know that Peter visited the West, and in 1696, Peter was about 24 years old when he actually became the sole ruler of Russia. That's pretty young at that time. We also know that by 1697, he decided to embark on what he called this Grand Embassy, which was essentially a long visit to Western Europe. His goal was that he wanted to learn about European customs and industrial techniques. So he saw the western parts of Europe as being sort of modern and technologically advanced, and he wanted Russia to catch up. He felt that Russia had been left behind. And so he was very interested in learning all the techniques of industry that were emerging in Europe, or Western Europe at that time period. Now, he actually visited the Netherlands, England, and Austria, and he did this sort of secretly. He didn't let people know that he was traveling to those places, so he tried to keep his identity a secret. It didn't always work, though, because Peter was quite large. He was over 6 foot tall, and he had a habit of gesticulating when he walked, which meant his arms and his legs sort of swayed around all over the place. So most people knew that when this 6 foot tall guy with swaying arms was walking through, who was Russian, it was most likely Peter. And so it was hard to keep his identity a secret. Now, while he did try to keep it secret, he often wore the plain clothes of an ordinary worker, and in fact he labored as a ship's carpenter, especially in the Netherlands. He was very interested in building his own navy, and he felt the best way to learn about naval technology was literally to become a shipwright, a ship's carpenter. And so he believed that by learning those techniques himself, he could help to bring that information back to Russia and help make Russia build its own navy and help modernize Russia and westernize Russia. So it's really interesting that here's this guy who's essentially a king slash emperor, a czar of Russia, and this czar of Russia is actually most of the time hanging out with sort of common guys. He was into woodworking and also metalworking. He was interested in cannon making, forging cannons. And so again, he engaged in those kinds of pursuits. So it's not the sort of thing that you would often think of a king or monarch, or in this case, a Russian czar of doing, but in this case, he actually did these things. Peter also had a series of reforms that he passed when he returned back to Russia. One of them was that he brought the Russian Orthodox Church under state control, and he set up what he called the Holy Synod to run the church under his direction. In this case, what Peter was trying to do was basically assert his authority over the church as the Russian czar. Now, this is very similar to what had happened in the Byzantine Empire under Justinian, where Justinian had ruled as the church and the state combined, with him in charge of the church. So Peter was following the Byzantine model, unlike the Western European model, where church officials and the Pope oftentimes dictated to monarchs what the rules should be in terms of their leadership and their being chosen as monarchs of those states. In this case, Peter wanted to be in control of not just the state, but also the church. He also reduced the power of the great landowners by giving able men from lower-ranking families positions of authority. So this was unusual. Instead of just giving nobles all the highest positions in government and the military, he essentially gave it to people who were capable of doing the work themselves. This is what we call a meritocracy. People who basically did a good job received the merit, and the merit got them promotions. This, of course, did not make many of the nobles happy. They felt that those jobs should only go to sort of wealthy people or people of noble birth, people who had noble blood. But Peter was willing to give it to anybody who was capable and smart, including people who might be of peasant origin. He also modernized his army. So to do that, he hired European officers who drilled his soldiers in European tactics and European weapons. So again, the idea here was he wanted to have a modern army, a modern navy, and he thought the best way to do that was to go to Western Europe, hire people to come back and help train his officers and his men so that he could have a modern army as well. Now, Peter's also known as a great westernizer of Russia. He wanted to bring Western culture there. Interestingly, he introduced potatoes to Russia, which became a staple of the Russian diet. Remember, the potato was a New World plant. It had been discovered in the Inca civilization and brought back by some of the conquistadors back to Spain. But eventually the potato made its way across Western Europe and made its way to Russia. It's a cheap product. In this case, it could be grown almost anywhere. And of course, it's a carbohydrate, which is really great because it actually helped improve the diet of many of the poor people in Russia, particularly the Russian peasants. He also started Russia's first newspaper and edited its first issue himself. So this was important. That part of the idea of westernization was to be able to print news, to print something like a newspaper. But the fact that he edited himself was important as well. It suggested that he wanted to retain control over the dissemination of information throughout Russia. So by being its first editor, he made sure he wasn't just producing a new newspaper, but he was using the news to promote news that he wanted to have spread, things that most likely said that he and his government were good. He also raised women's status by having them attend social gatherings. This was unusual. Traditionally, women in Russia, particularly unmarried women, would not have socialized with men that they didn't know or weren't related to. So by having women sort of come to these social gatherings like dances and balls and parties, he was trying to help elevate their status, but he was also trying to westernize them as well. He was introducing Western styles of fashion, Western styles of music, the high idea of Western style dances and balls, much like he had seen in Europe when he was visiting monarchs in Europe. And these helped to bring women back into the public scene and helped raise their status as well. He also ordered nobles to give up their traditional clothes for Western fashions. So again, he was trying to get people to stop being Russian and in fact be more Western, like he had seen in places like England or the Netherlands, or maybe the latest styles, which of course were French. And one of the things he also made noblemen do was basically shave off their beards. A tax was imposed on beards, and then he forced them essentially to shave off their beards and have clean-shaven faces like he had seen in Western Europe. This didn't go over very well with the nobles because they had traditionally worn long beards as part of their Russian traditions. And so to ask these people to give up this long-held tradition of wearing long beards as a sort of fashion style was seen by Peter as an attempt at westernizing Russia, but by the nobles it was seen as him imposing their will upon him. And that's really important that you understand that Peter was seen as an absolute monarch, much like Louis XIV was, or maybe the Charles I was in England. But in this case, Peter's a little bit different than, say, Louis XIV. Louis XIV saw himself as being subject to his own laws. He was not above the law. Peter, on the other hand, believed he was above the law and oftentimes imposed these laws that he created on people, but he didn't abide by them himself. That's what we call a despot. A leader who does not abide by his own laws is practicing despotism. So in many ways, Peter, as Tsar of Russia, was actually being despotic because he was ruling above the law, as if the laws did not apply to him. That's what makes him different than many of the other monarchs or absolute monarchs in Europe at that time.